Okay, wait, put it down, and go. Here, this is. Take one.
I like it, the chalk and the wood, the wooden things.
Yeah.
Okay, can you guys tell us your names?
Yes, Pinchas Yankel Wolofsky or Jacob Peter Wolofsky.
And what year were you born?
1931, March the 25th, in Montreal.
And
And I am Yehuda Leib Wolofsky, better known as Yudel and Wolofsky. Likewise born in Montreal, but at the Jewish General, I don't think he was. And that was in 1935, on April the 6th.
where were you born?
At the Women's General Hospital, which was on Dorchester and St. Lawrence, and then became the Montreal General eventually, but I was born at the Women's General Hospital.
And why were you born there?
Because there was no Jewish general.
I was one of the, I think that the place, the gynecological department opened in January of 1935, and I was born in April. I was one of the first year's product of the Jewish General.
What street did you grow up on?
4163 Esplanade, facing Fletcher's Field, which is now Jeanmon's Park. And grew up there next to the Grenadier Guards Armory.
More next, it was a common wall with the Canadian Grenadier Guards Armory.
And down the street from the Jewish Public Library, which had been built as the first to house the original Montefiore Club, then moved down to Guy Street, and Hirsch over here arranged for the Jewish Public Library to move in there.
Yeah.
But before that, your grandmother and grandfather were married in that same building or same edifice, which
Nobody on the planet is going to know who my grandmother
my
was.
mother
You
and-
need to
well,
give
our-
names.
our mother and father, Phil Wolofsky and Riva Yaroslavsky Wolofsky, were married in 1921 in the building which at that time still housed the Montefiore Club. And as I said, right
Half a
after-
block from where we lived. They had to walk up the half a block to be at home. That was 4099. That was 4099, and we were at 4163.
What's your earliest memories of growing up on Esplanade?
My memories are what was inculcated into me by my parents.
Both?
Playing on the right in the middle of the street. Esplanade was not, well, there were very few cars anyway, but mostly horses and horse wagons carrying the milk or carrying the ice and so on, and bread. But playing in the middle of the street rather than the mountain, which is right there. The park, which was Fletcher's Field, was nice to play in, but we called it the mountain, although it wasn't the mountain. Across the street and we were on the mountain. That's what I remember playing. And of course, it was during the war, my best memories. And being right next to the armory, they had guard posts right in front of their entrance, two guard posts, which is 10 paces away from where we lived, 15, and they had guards marching day and night up and down on the sidewalk right up to our house, back and forth, 24 hours a day during the war. So I remember the guards marching very clearly, back and forth.
Did you ever, as a kid, try to get in with their processions or imitate them? Or
I'm sure we must have. I'm sure, but they were walking straight back and forth without indication that they were alive other than their feet moving in perfect rhythm. I don't know, you must remember them, of course, too.
Of course, I remember them. I mean, you could try and talk to them. They just would not talk. They looked straight ahead. They were like animated.
Like robots.
Robots, yeah. They never spoke to you. They had little guardhouses at both sides of the entrance into the armory. That was sort of like they'd move in there, and every 10 minutes they'd move out, march up and down, one going north, the other one going south, and they'd march. And there were 3 cannons, which before the war we played on. We played on the 3 cannons, and then during the war they took them away and melted them down for the metal scrap. But before the war there were these 3 cannons in front, and we would play on them. No, my first memories are of the fact, I think, were of when the house next door to us was demolished by a Mr. Freifeld, and they built the apartments, the Mackenzie apartments. And I went to my Zadie Yaris and said, in Yiddish, ich will nicht kleine Häuser. I don't want small houses, because these apartments were small apartments, so they made out of it. So that's one of the first memories. The other memories.
What was the significance of that? Like, you're telling your grandfather that you don't want small houses.
I didn't want him to take and destroy our house. I mean, it was our home. Don't sell it. Don't let someone else build apartments on our. Because down the street, the Sorrel was also a private home, which had been converted into apartments, and Dr. Garber had been in that house prior, and he did operations. He did tonsillectomies in that house. Well, again, during the 30s, when I was still and then they, as I said, they converted it into apartments. And next to him, like going on the other side of the lane, there was a lane in between, was another apartment building, a 4-story apartment building, which belonged to the Drazens.
Right.
And the Drazens, in fact, as a kid, I remember once one of the Drazens, I think it's Joe, or when I came and I wanted to play with them, they said, "Scram" to me, and I ran home crying. "Mommy, Joe Drazen called me Scram." She says, "Don't play with him."
They were the wealthy, the rag.
Yeah, they were kind of the rag.
Of course, they never stopped being the wealthy family in Montreal, the Drazens.
And the synagogue, the synagogue, the Adas, the Hever Shas synagogue was on St. Urban Street, right behind our house. And Bubby Yaris used to take a seat only for the high holidays, for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, and she'd sit right at the last seat in the row next to the window, which would open up. So we'd go out on the back of our house, on the top of the garage of our house, and she would see us, and we'd sort of wave to her sitting in the last seat in shul. So it was like, because I didn't really enjoy going into shul to visit her upstairs, even though she was there. Yom Kippur, she stayed from the beginning right to the end. And Zadie, I don't remember. Zadie Yaris used to come out.
He died when I was only 4, and so you were 8.
I was 8. That was a big.
So talk a bit about the religion part, because you're saying that you had, your grandmother going to shul, but you weren't in shul. So talk a bit about where religion fell back in the 30s and 40s.
It didn't play any much of a role with us because...
Except the kashrut. That was very important in the house.
But not...
We had 4 sets of dishes.
Yeah, we had 2 sets, milk and meat, but
Plus Pesach.
But Pesach the dishes, so they would change the dishes. And at that time, you paid $0.25 to go to a movie, and they gave you a free dish. So my father used to go to the Belmont Theater, to the Hollywood Theater. The Belmont was on Mount Royal, and the Hollywood was on St. Lawrence, just south of Duluth. And he'd see a picture and he'd come back, and I think they built the whole Pesach the Kedisha set from the dishes from the movies that they got as credit. But because we were living with our grandparents,
On the maternal side, our maternal grandparents.
maternal, that was Bubby and Zadie Yaroslavsky or Yaros. Because we were living with them, we had always had a maid in the house, someone to help Bubby, Reva, my mother, our mother, your grandmother.
Stop saying it. I've never met that interviewer in my life.
Yeah.
I don't know who she is.
You need to pretend I'm a stranger.
My mother always had someone to help her in the house with the housekeeping. At that time, we had a two-story
I was
house.
about to say that.
And downstairs was a large living room and the kitchen and the entrance foyer with a beautiful staircase going up to the second floor. And on the second floor, we had 4 bedrooms. And the 4th bedroom was rented out. And
How much?
$5, $10.
maybe $5 a month.
Yeah.
And
Who did you rent it out to?
well, there was a fellow by it was rented out to a fellow by the name of Noach Resnick, who my parents, and this is a long story as well, because my father served in the first army that fought for Israel, for a state in Palestine in 1917. First army in 2,000 years fighting for a state. And he joined when he was 17 against the will of his father and his mother. But he joined up, and that's a whole other story.
This was his father.
This was his father.
That's what I said.
our
This was
grandfather.
his father.
Yeah, and he served in the and they were trained in Amherst, Nova Scotia. Amherst, Nova Scotia, and while there he met. He didn't remember the name because there were many people, but in the 1930s. They received a letter at the Keneder Adler saying, we know that someone who served in the army with me in Israel was involved in the Jewish paper in Montreal. We don't know his name, and somehow that letter ended up at the Keneder Adler, and my Zeta gave it, or my Uncle Dan gave it to my father, and he came home. What the letter said is they have someone in Russia that they want to bring out of Russia. And could you help him, because the United States was sealed off, but Canada was still allowing some people from Russia, some Jews, to come in. So my father came back home and told Mummy, my mother, about it. And she says, well, he's my cousin. From now on, he's my cousin. And so they made all the applications with the help of Uncle Leon Crestall to get him into Canada. And they brought him over as their cousin. And they brought him, Noach, brother. This was Noach. And he then, with him being there, they brought over his sister Zlata, and they brought over his twin brothers, who were Yitzchak and the other brother. But the other brother, Yitzchak's other brother, who came over. said he's smart enough to go into the United States. He's going to steal into the United States. And he did that. He tried to sneak into the United States. He was caught at the border, shipped back to Canada, and Canada said, hey, we don't need you, and they shipped him back to Russia. And I met him in Israel after Lasnos, or whatever you want to call it, in Russia. And he finally made Aliyah to Israel, and I met him in Israel, this other brother, and we talked about his early years and the Wolofskys, how they helped him come out. But Noach stayed in our house, in that spare room, till my Bubba said, Noach, ich will dir machen a shidduch. And they made a shidduch with him, they got him married off, and that's another long story, because eventually he did go to the States. His brother Zimmel, who had written the original letter to my father, helped bring him into the States. But again, that's another.
Then there's a whole story about him during the the War of Independence.
Zimmel.
Go ahead, tell the story, Uncle
That's
Yudi.
Zimmel.
He had
Amusement
he
park.
had lived in Asbury Park, New Jersey, and he had what do you call it, a fun park, an amusement park
At the beach.
and he kept in all the storage in the amusement park. He kept tons and tons and tons of war material that eventually was somehow disappeared from there and got into the hands of the Palmach and into the hands of the people who were fighting for the War of Independence
The War
for
of
Israel.
Independence.
He was.
Can you quickly tell me who's Leon Krestal in a full sentence?
Leon Krestal is our uncle. He was a lawyer, good reputation, a good profession, by the way, and he then ran for parliament in the Cartier district, which
First
was
of
a
all,
district.
Leon Krestal was married to
our-
aunt,
to
my
our-
father's oldest.
to this gentleman's daughter, eldest daughter, okay,
Sophie Krestal.
Sophie, who lived to be 100 or 99. Be that as it may, he eventually, there was a gentleman by the name of Fred Rose, who you might have heard of, who was a member of Parliament for Cartier, who somehow did the wrong things and was eventually put in jail. I don't know, who knows what he did, and eventually went back to
Well, it
Poland.
was part of the Gazenko.
I know what.
Okay, but you have to understand,
And
guys.
Leon Krestal ran for parliament and was the Jewish member of parliament for Quebec, for all of Quebec. There was nobody else. That's who Leon Krestal was, our uncle. And he was for what, about three sessions, about 12, 15 years, I think he was there, until he died.
Actually,
Okay, why don't you introduce the gentleman behind you?
This gentleman behind.
Who is that?
That's Hirsch Wolofsky, our grandfather, who, and there's a story there too, who came here in 1900. Our father was 6 months, was just born, and his brother Aaron was already here in.
Not our father's brother. Aaron is the brother of.
His brother Aaron
Hirsch.
was already here. Hirsch was the youngest of 4 brothers in Poland. And he started out here in Montreal, in the area around the Lower St. Lawrence, had a fruit store, and brought over my grandmother, his wife. 6 months later, my father was 6 months old when he came here. And when my father was 7 years old, he was playing in the back of the fruit store with matches and started a fire in the fruit store. And my Zeta collected $5,000 from the insurance company and said, I'm not starting back a fruit store. The community needs a voice. And with a few other partners who also put in $1,000 each, they started the Keneder Adler.
Canadian Jewish Eagle in English.
And
Canadian Eagle. Started in 1907.
And then he became a very strong leader of the downtown Jews as opposed to the uptown Jews. The uptown Jews were the Westmount gang who had already made it. And
they were mostly German,
well,
mostly
not all.
Western European. He was the Eastern.
There was some
European.
Eastern as well, but they had made it. They had been here, made it to the first Aliyah to Canada.
In the 1880s. They came about the 1880s.
So, and this is, you can read it in Pierre Antil's work. And in,
We're not reading any Pierre Antil. We want the stories from you guys.
But that story came before we were born. We're recounting things.
Anyway, so he became very active in organizing the Jewish community. He was called upon by the leaders in the community, and he really became the voice of the community.
Uncle Yudi, what's your first memory of being inside the newspaper? What did it look like? What did it smell like? What did it feel like?
Well, it had all of its printing and old linotype machines and all that type of stuff in the basement. When you walked in, right at the door, there was our grandfather's office, and right next to it was Uncle Dan, who was the second oldest. Our father was the first. Our father was the eldest of 7 children. Dan was number 2. His
I'm
office.
going to correct you. My grandfather's office was upstairs on a mezzanine.
That was later.
No.
Or that was before. No, that was where
always
Rabinovich went in the back.
Rabinovich and Zadie and Ginsburg and had their offices upstairs.
Well, maybe when you remember, but I'm talking about what I remember. It
Because
came later.
by the time you came around, Yudi, I'm going to remind you,
Yeah.
your Zadie was home, wasn't coming.
No, he still had that office
The
there.
office in the front was Uncle Dan. There was only one office
There
in
were
the
2
front.
offices. I'm sorry, I remember 2 little offices. Okay, that's the way I remember it. Maybe you remember it differently.
Absolutely
And then then he went to the home. It took a while. Okay, he didn't. When I remember, he was still going to the office. He then got sick very soon afterwards.
But he was upstairs.
Right behind that, right after you passed, there was a passageway, and then that's where the front office staff had their seats. Somewhat of the business part of it, where people came in either to buy newspapers, which were very expensive. They were 2 cents a paper. 1 cent before we were there, but 2 cents by the time I got there. And where they took ads. And then further back, they had the accountant's little office, and right in the back were the editorial staff, the editors, and all these people whose pictures you see here. Yudel Siegel, Mrs. Rabinovich, not only Rabinovich, but his wife, B.G. Sack was upstairs, and they had Ginsburg and
Medrash.
Madras, Dr. Madras, who used to be a professor at Concordia, or was it still St. George? Was it still Sir George at that time? Who died with his father. And then in the back, they had a little upper alcove where they had a big office, which I remember as being where Rabinovich was, who was the editor, other than our grandfather was really the editor-in-chief, but he stayed in his home. He was always in bed at home. And then if you went down the stairs, you saw I'm telling you what I remember. Do you mind? I worked there. You didn't work there.
I didn't, I didn't work there?
Well, you didn't work there when I worked there.
Yeah, sure, because I was gone off to university.
I
That was already 1948.
I worked there from 47 till 1950. For 3 years I worked there. For the fall of 47, for 3 years. the downstairs, as you walk downstairs, there's a whole set of linotype operators, each with their own machine. And one was English and all the rest were Yiddish. And there was one English linotype operator and all the rest were Yiddish. And then behind them was the setting up of the newspaper. And on the other side was one big printing press for the newspaper. One big printing press for the newspaper. And little behind it was all the various other printing apparatus, the small presses, all these various little things for commercial printing rather than newspaper printing. And they did commercial printing as well as newspaper printing. And it certainly had the smell. I had my name, and everybody had their names made in little linotype slugs at least 1,000 times by these various people. And they were very.
What does that mean? Tell me what that means.
Well,
tell the future generations what that means.
What a linotype machine is?
No, well, you said they had their names done in...
No, it was just type.
When you lead.
The linotype machine had molten lead, a big molten lead, and there was a typewriter which typed letters which sent the letters, little slugs, hot slugs, and the letters were imprinted on the slugs, thin little slugs, and these were lines. They were as long as a newspaper line. And then they would cool off very quickly, and these lines were the lines of the story, or the lines of the news, whatever it was that was going to be in the newspaper. And then there was a man who set these lines into columns and in frames that were made to hold them. And he was in charge of setting them up. But all these people did is get the stories that they had to convert into these lead slugs. So you came and you said, please make a slug with my name on it. They made a slug with your name on it. You know, it was a present. The slugs they were remelted afterwards. The slugs were remelted after they were used. That's how the newspaper was printed. The newspaper started printing in the evening, and it went till God knows what, 2, 3 in the morning, I think. And the newspapers were all piled up and ready. And we had a man by the name of Brunovsky who had a store that sold stationery. I know the word. Give me time. That sold stationery on St. Lawrence Boulevard. He had a store right below Ontario. And he would drive up with his car, and he'd get these bundles of newspapers, and he'd go distributing. They weren't distributed throughout the whole city, and the city was much, much, much smaller. And he'd make his distribution, and there used to be newspaper kiosks all over the place. I don't know whether they were still there when you people might remember, but Mr. Drapo decided he didn't like the kiosks, and they all disappeared eventually. They would be little wooden or tin kiosks on the sidewalk at various places in the downtown area that sold newspapers, and they would be distributed to the various kiosks. And when I started working there, I was 12. The newspaper, after our father died, his eldest son, our father died in August 1947. He was 47 years old. They had 2 staffs. They had a staff that came at 8 o'clock in the morning that worked till 6, and then they had the nighttime staff, which came after 8. And there was nobody there from 6 to 8, other than downstairs. So I was the sole person that sat in the front to take ads if people came in for ads, to put ads in the newspaper, which were on the front. On the bottom of the front page and the second page. The ads weren't at the end; they were at the front page, not the top. The bottom of the
only
front.
the death notices.
The death notices
only the death
and
notices
inside
were on the front page.
Yeah, the death notices were on the front page, and I take ads, and also there were the desks. We had an English newspaper, an English weekly called the Chronicle. And the editor of that was A.M. Klein. I'm sure you must have heard of A.M. Klein. He was absolutely brilliant, that man. brought me into the habit of being a lexicologist and being a lover of words and a lover of good words. Every time I sat beside him, I learned my vocabulary increased by 5 or 6 words, which I practiced over and over just to know I wouldn't. He was a beautiful instructor as far as I was concerned for me, and he wrote wonderful editorials, and I would love to sit there. There was also Mr. Gallet, who was the Jewish editor. The news that we got was usually yesterday's news. Today's Star, Montreal Star, would be tomorrow's Keneder Adler, and also we got all the newspapers, the U.S. newspapers, the New York newspapers, the Forwards, the Morning Journal, and they came up, and we also had telegrams. We got our news by telegrams, which were delivered, and that's how we got our news. And that was the front page of the next day. So I used to take ads. I know that the wording that the newspaper used was not perfect Yiddish. They made it more anglicized Yiddish, because I remember, and I don't know whether I mentioned this to you before, I would take an ad, the first few times I'd take an ad, someone would come in having a room to rent, and I would write in Yiddish properly, Zimmer zu verdingen, and the information, I would bring it downstairs to the linotype people, and they look at me and they laugh. Not Zimmer zu verdingen, room zu verrenten. That's the way you had to say it. And the same thing, furniture for sale, I put Mebel zu verkaufen. No, it says furniture zu verkaufen. It was a slang Yiddish in any event, anglicized Yiddish. I learned quickly that anglicized Yiddish, but I was there from 6 to 8, and Sunday mornings. There was nobody there Sunday mornings. There was what I remember, right at the end of the wall there was the old telephone exchange, just like you see in the old movies of the 30s, with an operator. There were 3 consecutive telephone lines, Belair 2838, 2839, and 2830. If you dialed in one and the other was busy. And you had the plug-ins and the whole thing. And I used to sit there and talk to 3 different people, at the same time, and you could use the other. They didn't block each other off. You did block them off by putting the plugs in where you wanted to, but you could listen in and do all these things. It was great fun, because there was all kinds of numbers you could call at that day you can't call anymore on phones. 1191 would ring back, all sorts of numbers that no longer exist.
What do you mean? What do you mean?
If you dialed 1191 and hung up, the phone would ring back. That was everywhere. But they don't exist. That was Bell Telephone in those days. Was a 6-digit, a name, first 2 letters of a name, and 4 numbers. Six numbers altogether. Before they got rid of all the offices with all the names. Belair, Cadillac, what was it? Crescent, Dollard, D.O., Harbor, H.A. We were Belair.
Okay, what other numbers do you remember would do stuff like?
Our home number. How could we forget? We had it for many years.
No, but you said you dialed something and it would call back. What other?
1191. There was a few other numbers that people called, and all the lines got jammed together on purpose. You could hear 50 different people talking at the same time because everybody called the same number. They didn't have the clarity that they have today. 50 people would call one number, which was never busy, but you could always hear all the other people talking. I don't remember those numbers. Those weren't key, but they had a few of those. That's what I wasted my time in while I was waiting for customers to come in to buy a few newspapers at 2 cents a piece and keep the place open. That I remember, the Keneder Adler. He was there before.
What story can you tell us about being 6 years old and learning how to read and showing up at the Keneder Adler?
Oh, well, my dad always went on Sunday morning. Dad would go to the paper, the office, and he'd take me. take me during the week I was going to school, so I couldn't go down, but in those, you're talking now the 30s, one of the first thing I knew was the alphabet. And when I went downstairs, I opened a case of letters, because aside from the work on the typing of articles on the linotype, any assembly was made up of different sizes of letters on the headings, and these headings had to be assembled from separate. Each face was a separate face, and you had to put them. So you had them in boxes, and there were probably about 50 different cases, and I opened one case and I see it's an A, but then after the A it's an S, and after the S it's an E, and I said, gee, they're all mixed up. So I took all these letters and I put them into the A, B, C, D, E, F, all the way, the proper way an alphabet is supposed to run. Of course, my father came home on Monday and he says, don't come to the office for the next couple of weeks because Trossman is going to kill you.
Mr. Trossman
was the foreman of the shop, and he's the guy that saw what was going on. Because I was never told, I was a kid, that the letters are put in the order by the ones in this little corner are used most often, which is the A and the S and the M and the N and
just like typewriter keys.
But the keys on the linotype were not the same as the keys on a typewriter. They had their own code. So if you looked at the keys on the linotype, again, at the very beginning, you couldn't read the letters because they were all rubbed off. On the rest of the board, they were there. But I'm going to correct my brother because I was there longer. The back, the front, as I said, my grandfather had his office upstairs. Benjamin Sachs had his office upstairs.
Sachs was upstairs too.
Rabinovich had his office upstairs.
Yeah, the big
and
one.
Siegel, when he came, had his office upstairs. That was the Schreibers. Downstairs was Medrash, who was the city editor. Next to him was Ginsberg.
In the back, Mrs. Rabinovich, don't forget.
And beside them, my father, who did the accounting, had his office, and beside my father's office was Mr. Veschler, who was married to one of my father's cousins. And in fact, his sister was married to Richter Usher. So Richter was married to Wolofsky. And these three girls, and that was also a sister who was married to a Handelman in St. Agathe, who had the Chalet Hotel where we worked the summers, making the money to put ourselves through university. Both he and I worked there. But that was a cousin of our father's.
Just like the students today, we paid our full way, you know. No.
But so there was a whole, but anyway, Veschler, who was the managing editor of the Chronicle, the Canadian Jewish Chronicle, which my grandfather bought. There was another Jewish, Anglo-Jewish paper run by someone by the name of Ryan, and he was giving it up. So my grandfather, Hirsch, bought it as a weekly Anglo-Jewish paper. And he hired A.M. Klein to be its editor. And he wrote editorials which were very biting and, of course, very socialist in outlook. And all these editorials have been published in Beyond Sabachin. If you take the book Beyond Sabachin, these are the editorials which he which he wrote for the Canadian Jewish Chronicle.
Okay,
And
let's,
they were all erudite. They were all, nothing was written, his language was just superb.
okay, let's talk about sort of the political atmosphere of the time and what was the kind of where did the Jewish community stand in terms of the political spectrum?
My grandfather was a committed red liberal. And I mean capital
Why?
L liberal. Because he basically felt that during the time before Mackenzie King, it was the liberals who allowed Jews into Canada, and so that was where he felt his loyalty was. And Leon Crestal was a
Capital
member
L
of
liberal.
the capital L liberal, being elected to Parliament. There was a lot of communism, but my grandfather abhorred it. And yet, his son,
Two sons.
Moshe Wolofsky, ended up by mistake, ended up in Russia in 1930. He couldn't get a job in the summer. He was attending Columbia University. But before he went to Columbia University, he was at Commercial High, and that's where he met Kosovotsky, whose first name I can't remember, and they became very close friends. And they went to New York, studied in New York together, and worked 10 jobs at the same time. And to keep themselves in New York. And also my uncle, their older brother, was already in New York and practicing as a lawyer. That's Max Wolofsky, who eventually came back when my father died and became the managing director of the Canada.
He took over, in fact, our father's position.
In 1947. Merle Wolofsky Frankel was our cousin, and she became very active in Jewish education in Montreal. And
Can we stick to one topic so that we could actually use some sound bites?
Yes.
Okay.
So
can we, I would really like you guys to focus on the political atmosphere of
well,
the
I'm telling
time
you, so the political, there
without
was
the
communist-
parentheses.
So there was the Communist Party, which was active, which the Keneder Adler was very vehement in its opposition, although it probably had some feelings for the Socialist Party, for his father David Lewis.
David Lewis.
And he was a very close friend of A.M. Klein's, and also professor at McGill, Professor Scott, who was also a poet, was also involved in the
Frank Scott was one of my professors. Frank Scott was a brilliant man.
Yeah. Anyway, he
Brilliant,
was also
brilliant.
a socialist. So there was some leaning towards it, but the essence of the paper was the policy of the Liberal government of Canada. And
But the atmosphere generally
Was very-
during the war, when Russia joined the Allies, I mean, Russia was not in the parentheses, was not, the Iron Curtain didn't exist at that time. Everyone was very happy in the entire community. That's when Fred Rose was able to get elected as the Labour Progressive representative of Montreal. Not Montreal, of Cartier in Montreal. Because it was not, there was no McCarthy yet. The atmosphere had not changed yet. And socialists and communists, and it was left-leaning. The atmosphere was basically left-leaning. I remember when I was in Barabing, in the first year we still paid a fee of, I think, $2 a month or something to, or I forget what it was, to attend school. And a guy by the name of Sam Carr, I don't think anybody remembers Sam Carr, came around with what do you call it, petitions to sign in the classrooms. We're all signing petitions to abolish the fee for going to high school. Like the students today, we didn't go on strike. We only signed the petitions. And somewhere there's a petition that I signed, 1947 or 1940, around that time, 48, in 1948, a petition to the Protestant School Board of Greater Montreal. No, there was not a Greater, the Protestant School Board of Montreal, to abolish the fee for going to high school. But it was communist people who ran and did that thing. And we had in our houses, as my brother just said, we had 2 floors, but the 3rd floor, there was a gentleman who was a full-fledged communist, who worked for the communists, eventually had to leave Montreal and go to Vancouver, but and there was also,
Do you remember his name?
Sidney Zarkin.
his name was Sarkin, S-A-R-K.
Sidney Zarkin. And he's mentioned in our uncle's book as someone who influenced him. This is in a book called A Perfectly Red Life.
Anyway, but he was like 100% communist, and there would be meetings and all sorts of things that went on.
Do you guys remember A.M. Klein running for the CCF?
Yes.
Or what? Okay, what do you remember about A.M. Klein running for the CCF?
I was too young to really get involved at that time, but I remember that when he was running for the CCF, and he was editing the Chronicle, but I remember seeing what do you call it, offices with the name, CCF, A.M. Klein.
He was also a lawyer, very practical.
Jake Klein and Aronovich was the firm.
But what do you remember about A.M. Klein running?
Well, I just remember he ran, but the paper was not, even though he was an editor of the Chronicle, my grandfather wouldn't, he was for the Liberal candidate who at that time...
Yeah, he had control. Our grandfather had control of the editorial outlook of the paper.
But that didn't stop my grandfather allowing a debate on the question of should there be a state of Israel or not a state of Israel. That debate took place all the time in the paper.
So why did he allow a debate within Canadian political society?
Not really, no.
Wait, stop. I asked that question badly because they're never going to use my voice. So talk to me about useful sentences, Canada versus the United States.
He was very loyal to the Liberal government, and he would not in any way allow a debate to take place. There was only one right way to vote, and that right way was for the Liberal Party, politically. So even though A.M. Klein ran for the CCF, he did not get my grandfather's backing for that purpose. He got my grandfather's backing for his editorials on Jewish affairs, I remember one editorial when Mordechai Kaplan in 1945 abolished the idea of Judaism as being the chosen people, and he took him up on that. But then at the same time, he took the Rabbinical Council in New York to task for burning Kaplan's book. He did a lot. He took up other struggles, providing it was within the Jewish community, but not, and how anything affected the Jewish community. But
Can you either of you talk about the plurality of thought within the Jewish community back then? Because it seems that now we've become kind of one-issue Jews, and I'm curious to know what kind of plurality of thought was there within the community?
Well, there was everything. I mean, there were the communists, the Yiddishists, the Yiddishist communists, the Yiddishist labor, the Bund people. There was the labor Zionists. There was the Politzionists. There was every type of Jewish involvement, and there were the anti-Zionists, which were essentially the Bundists, in a sense, were anti-Zionists. They felt that the place to build a socialist organization was where you lived. And of course there were a lot of people who worked with the labor unions, not necessarily as communists, but worked for the labor unions as socialists. I mean, we got it on Esplanade on the mountains, and we got it in front of Horn's restaurant. If you came to Horn's restaurant on Sunday morning, there was always, which was right next door to the Keneder Adler.
One building removed, right on the corner of Duluth and St. Lawrence Boulevard.
So if you came to the Keneder Adler on Sunday morning, you had a phalanx of people outside of Horns, which went into Horns for a cup of coffee, but but they sat out, they bought their Keneder Adler, and they argued, you know. And I can tell you a little story which happened in 1949. Already Israel was already established, but by that time the Jewish Immigrant Aid had moved onto Esplanade, and they were just north of Rachel and up on the second floor in what used to be Dr. Stillman's home. And
Joseph Cage, of course, was running it.
Kajdan, I knew.
Kajdan,
Lair
Kajdan. He taught in Canada and Fochel as Lair Kajdan.
And I was walking back from McGill University, and there were a group of Jews sitting there and arguing in Yiddish, and one's yelling, "Die Kapitalisten haben nicht genug Geld, und die Kapitalisten haben begangen von you capitalists, we don't have enough money, and you capitalists have stolen the money," and the other guy's yelling, and the communists, and finally he says, and they're waving their hands, and they're and yelling at each other, and one of them says, finally the capitalist says, "You communists, go back to Russia, go back from where you came from." And I sort of was walking back, and I said, "Jeden, was schreit hier? Jews, why are you yelling? Why are you talk quietly?" And so he turns to me, "You communists, go back to where you came from," in Yiddish. So I looked at him and I laughed. From Dortmund bin ich gekommen. From there I came, pointing to the house at 4163. They were just across the road. And there were benches on Fletcher's Field. There was a walkway right around the whole of Fletcher's Field. And they had benches all along there. And the Jews used to come and
by the way,
settle the whole world problems right
and
there.
by the way, it was then totally grass. There were no tennis courts. There were no football fields. There were no.
I have the Bayern being played. Bayern being played soccer on
that
Fletcher.
came later in the middle.
Hey! I'm talking of 1944. Bayern was already.
But all there was the two wooden things, the two wooden goals.
On grass.
On grass. Yeah. There was two wooden goals. That's all there was in the entire, from Duluth till Montreal, nothing other than those two wooden posts. All the tennis courts, all the rest came later.
But what they did have, and we used to go walk across the mountain, a continuation of Fletcher's Field on Park Avenue, Duluth, going down towards Pine, was sand, and they had swings, and they had seesaws, and they had merry-go-rounds, and they had sandboxes, and for kids to play.
They
I
even
don't know
had,
if
they
that's-
even had underground tunnel to cross Duluth, to cross Park Avenue
I've never seen
from the east to, the west or back underneath. You could go under. They had a tunnel.